Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Alex Brubaker. I'm the manager here at the Scholar, and I'm switching things up today. I'm live in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, of course, in the United States, for the weekend celebrating Father's Day with my dad. So a special shout out to all the dads out there. Happy Father's Day. Thanks so much for tuning in, and welcome to our live stream series where we host authors and speakers, and we keep the conversation going about books we love. Our featured book this afternoon is Appeasement by Tim Bouverie. Here it is. If you haven't yet purchased the book, I'd like to encourage you to do so. It is now available in paperback, and purchasing Tim's book through us helps support the author, and it helps support us as an indie bookstore and makes this event series sustainable and free to the public. If you click the green button below, it will direct you to our website to purchase a new copy of Tim's book. And of course, while you're there, we also have copies available of Andrew's biography of Churchill and his other new book that came out last fall, Leadership in War. So click the link below and you'll be able to purchase any and all of these books from our authors here this afternoon. If you're watching this through Facebook Live or YouTube Live, look in the comments section and you should see we provided a link there as well, or simply head to midtownscholar.com. Now onto our program this afternoon. We are honored to welcome Tim Bouverie and Andrew Roberts to our virtual event series. Andrew Roberts is the best-selling author of Churchill, Walking with Destiny, The Story, Masters and Commanders, Waterloo, and Napoleon, which was the winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for Biography and a finalist for the Plutarch Award. He has won many other prizes, including the Wolfson History Prize and the British Army Military Book of the Year. He is a Roger and Martha Mertz Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, a Lerman Institute Distinguished Fellow at the New York Historical Society, and a visiting professor in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. Now, I have to extend just a warm thank you to Andrew for joining us this afternoon. He certainly didn't have to, but here he is. So to our viewers out there, please do me a favor while you're picking up Tim's book. Please go ahead and purchase Andrew's biography of Winston Churchill. It's called Churchill, Walking with Destiny, which the Wall Street Journal called unarguably the best single-volume biography of Churchill. And Andrew also has a new book out, like I mentioned before, called Leadership in War, Essential Lessons from Those Who Made History. So thank you again to Andrew for joining us today. Now, our featured author this afternoon is Tim Bouverie. Tim studied history at Christ Church, Oxford. Between 2013 and 2017, he was a political journalist for Channel 4 News in the UK. He regularly reviews books on history and politics for The Spectator, The Observer, and The Daily Telegraph. He lives in London. Our featured book, again, this afternoon is Appeasement. Here it is, Chamberlain, Hitler, Churchill, and the Road to War. I'll read just one blurb from Max Hastings. He writes that this is the debut of an unusually talented writer, one of the most promising young historians to enter our field in years. So now, before I hand it off to Andrew and Tim, I'd like to encourage you to ask questions. Please click the Ask a Question button. Again, it's below my face, below the green button. If you have a question for either Tim or Andrew, can't promise we'll get to all of them, but we'll save some time after the interview to go over your questions. But at this time, please join me in welcoming onto the screen Tim Bouverie and Andrew Roberts.
Alex, thank you very much indeed for those kind words. And thank you for inviting me on to interview Tim, who has written a really tremendous book. I mean, it's a fabulous, fabulous book. And the first question, I think, really asks itself, which is, Tim, this is not the first book on appeasement, any more than my book on Churchill was the first one on Churchill. There have been literally thousands written on these subjects. So what were you trying to achieve with this book, and what's special about it?
Well, thank you, Alex, and thank you very, very much, Andrew, for agreeing to do this conversation. I feel very embarrassed. I think that this should really be the other way around. I should be asking you questions. It's very, very kind of you to have done this, and I couldn't echo Alex's words about your biography of Churchill more. After Martin Gilbert's fantastic multi-volume, there's been a long wait for a single volume that encompasses and understands and explains Churchill's life as well as yours does. You're right, a lot's been written about appeasement, but I think there were three things I wanted to try and do differently. Whether I achieved is up to other people to judge. I wanted to look at the entire period, not just things that dealt with climax, the Munich Agreement, the Czech crisis of 1938, and the lead up to the Second World War. I thought that it was very important to try and begin the story with the accession of Hitler to power in January 1933. That was one. Secondly, I thought that I wanted to write a book which expanded the story, rather like Brexit in this country or all sorts of current political events. Appeasement was a massive talking point in British politics, and I wanted to look at how it was perceived in wider society, and indeed how smaller actors played their part, these people who I describe as the amateur diplomats who were continually visiting Germany throughout the course of the 1930s. I didn't just want to look at the main political protagonists. And finally, I wanted to write a narrative. A lot of those very distinguished academic books which you reference are exactly that. They're quite narrative, they're possibly quite dry. And I think we're so lucky in writing about the period that we do, that it is inhabited by so many extremely talented diarists and letter writers and diplomats who wrote these incredibly vivid, highly entertaining, very dramatic dispatches, entries, etc. And I thought that it was potentially possible to construct a narrative based on those diaries and dispatches and newspaper interviews, which really made the reader feel as if they were experiencing the sorts of moral dilemmas and crises that the politicians of the time were experiencing.
So go back to 1933. Tell me why. I mean, obviously, we all know January 1933 as the time that that Hitler grabbed power, seized power in Germany. Why was that such a key moment for your book, or at least the beginning of your book?
I think the whole appeasement question revolves around judgment. It's your judgment about what Adolf Hitler intends to do and what his regime stands for that ultimately depends, as the war clouds gather, on which side of the appeasement debate you're likely going to fall. And so I really wanted to be able to see how soon people perceived the danger posed by Hitler and how their attitudes changed to him as his coups continued to follow one after the other. And one of the important things I discovered, which I think goes against general popular conception, including my own before I began researching this book, is how much information there was in the public sphere about German atrocities with regard to the Jews, with regard to the Social Democrats and the Communists, the dismantling of German democracy in the early 1930s. People were extremely well informed. It wasn't as if people suddenly woke up in September 1938 and thought, God, this is a really bad man with a really sinister regime. There was tons of evidence beforehand. Now, there are reasons which we might discuss for why people chose to ignore that evidence, or good things about the regime which people liked, but I think there was a lot of information which filled the public sphere from January 1933 onwards.
And how important was public opinion in informing policy? I mean, there's an almost universal hatred of war, needless to say. Everybody had lost somebody they knew, many of them people in their own family in the Great War, which had swallowed 20 million lives or so. But wasn't that in and of itself going to create a huge, almost automatic support for appeasement?
I think absolutely. And I think that that is something which we can all identify with. None of us would have wanted to go to war again a mere 20 years after the war to end all wars with the same adversary. The slight subtlety which I try and explore a little bit in the book is public opinion appears and is and reacts to politics in a very different way today to the way it did in the 1930s. And that is due to the actually rather small number of media outlets that there were in the 30s and the extent that the government had control over them. It was a symbiotic relationship that, I mean, in Britain, the only broadcaster was the BBC, which was largely controlled by the government and was able to deny platforms to people like Winston Churchill, who disagreed with government policy. Most of the newspaper proprietors were very, very readily influenced by cabinet ministers telling them what line to take. And so while the desire to avoid war is absolutely crucial and a very, very real factor throughout a lot of this period, I am critical of the government for failing to do what Churchill was campaigning to do right from the beginning, which was to tell the British people the truth, to educate them about the threat of Nazi Germany. And had they been educated, then all the sort of arguments later on about was Britain ready for war in 1938, would the public have worn it, might have appeared quite different to how they appeared in that summer of 1938 when Britain almost did go to war.
So you think we could have gone to war before September 1939? Because a lot of historians feel that we wouldn't have had the empire behind us, that we wouldn't have had public opinion, as you mentioned earlier, behind us. We wouldn't have had the House of Commons together and supportive of a war any earlier than September 1939. And of course, Hitler didn't invade the rump of Czechoslovakia until the 15th of March 1939. But you do feel that we could have actually gone to war at the time of Munich, do you?
I do think so. I don't. That you've listed a number of very important objections and things which weighed very heavily with the cabinet at the time. But I mean, I think one can see a certain amount of evidence for the thesis that British public opinion at least was prepared to tolerate it. Nobody was going to go to war enthusiastically, and indeed they didn't go to war enthusiastically in 1939. But at the time, if you compare the reaction of the British public in 1938 to that of 1936, Harold Nicholson said at the time of the Rhineland crisis that there would be a general strike in Britain if Britain tried to kick the Germans out of the Rhineland. Well, when Halifax faces down Chamberlain in September 1938, it does look for a few days as if Britain really might go to war over Czechoslovakia. And there are no riots, there are no mass demonstrations. People are quite calmly digging trenches in Hyde Park and trying on gas masks. Sign up for the Territorial Army increases massively. Women are volunteering to drive ambulances and the like. So yes, I don't think that there was a massive enthusiasm for it, but opinion had hardened. Chamberlain had made two, and it had changed crucially in that month of September. Chamberlain had made two flying visits to Hitler. There was no doubt, I don't think, in almost anybody's mind in Britain that if there was a war, it was against the wishes of the British government. They'd bent over backwards to try and avoid it. But you are right. I think it is likely that if we did go to war in September 1938, we would not initially have had a large part of the dominions, particularly South Africa, with us. And that is something that needs to be weighed.
And you also touch in your book quite a lot on French, Russian, American diplomacy and their sources. Would you like to, although you concentrate mainly, of course, on Britain, would you like to elaborate on that, but specifically the French, Russians and Americans? Alex, my screen has now completely frozen.
Sorry, we're back.
Oh,
good.
there we go.
Okay. Sorry, had you frozen as well? Yes, the question was about the French, the Russians, the Americans. You talk about all of them in your book. Obviously, they're very key on this. Say a few words about them and the way in which they affected the crisis.
I think all of these players play an incredibly important role in trying to assess what sort of coalition there could be against Nazi Germany is always in the minds of the cabinet. And a key problem for the British is believing that they don't have a very reliable coalition that could go to war against the Nazis, but also that for a long time they haven't wanted to build one. I think that the British learn one of the wrong lessons from the First World War, which is that that Britain went to war in 1914, or one of the reasons war broke out in 1914 was this system of alliances and secret treaties, and therefore in order to avoid another war you need to have no alliances. But the book, although it touches on these, primarily focuses on Britain, and that isn't just because I'm a really dreadful linguist. The reason the book focuses on Britain is, and I don't know whether you agree with this, Andrew, is I think that this was the last moment in British history when the world was looking to Britain to take a lead. France was in political turmoil. There were 10 French governments between 1930 and 1933, and they continued a revolving round of ministries thereafter. America was entirely isolationist, and Russia was widely distrusted. And so at any moment, even though a lot of people in Britain wanted to be isolationist, certainly with regard to Eastern and Central Europe, if there was going to be a a linchpin of any anti-Nazi coalition. It had to involve Britain and her empire. And so Chamberlain, this, I think, one of the interesting things about him, he gets sucked in almost against his will to the negotiations with Hitler in September 1938, at a time when, simply because of Britain's power in the world and its moral authority, the fact that we're sending out a diplomatic mission under Lord Runciman to try and resolve this. Why are we trying to resolve a dispute in what Chamberlain famously described as a faraway country of which we know nothing, if we don't feel that what happens in almost every corner of the globe is inherently a British interest? After the outbreak of the war and after the entry of the Americans into the war in 1941, that ceases to be the case. But I do think this was the moment that the world was looking to Britain to rally opposition to German expansion.
Yes, no, exactly. Well, that makes perfect sense. But with regard to, let's go on to President Putin's speech of 2 days ago, which I'm sure you saw, with regard to his blaming Chamberlain for the Second World War, blaming the Munich Agreement, and saying there was no alternative for the Russians to do the Nazi-Soviet pact because the West had proved that it wasn't willing to fight. Do you think that argument holds any water?
Well, I think President Putin's claims, and indeed the claims of the Russian Foreign Ministry, that that the Russians were the only power prepared to stand up to the Germans before 1939, are completely ridiculous. As we know, it's the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that allows for the outbreak of the Second World War, and the Russians were responsible for annexing Poland and committing atrocities there. I think the biggest what if of the year 1938 and the Czech crisis is what role the Soviet Union would or wouldn't have played, and we can't know for certain. I think one thing, and there are lots of very good reasons for distrusting Stalin, as Churchill later found out. The curious thing is that while Chamberlain is very skeptical of Stalin, he seems entirely credulous, or at least willing to believe Hitler, and I think that there's an asymmetry there. That said, also, one has to take the facts that we have, and the facts that we have are that the Soviet Foreign Minister Maxim Litvinov had done a revolution in Soviet foreign policy and made it far more pro-Western in the years that he had been running the foreign policy of Russia. Russia joined the League of Nations. The Soviet Union had continually said that it was going to stand by Czechoslovakia. Even if they hadn't, having a neutral, or at least benevolent Russia, benevolent that is to the Allies, in a war against Germany, was obviously an Allied interest, rather than supplying Germany with all the mass of raw materials that the Soviet Union did between August 1939 right up to the German invasion in June 1941.
You play a lot in your book on the contributions made by what you call amateurs and also Third Reich tourists. I wonder if you'd like to say a few words about the influence that both of these different sets of people, I mean, what motivated them and what effect you think they had on the crisis.
I think the effect they had was almost wholly negative. Most of the people that have an influence are from some form of what would later be called the establishment. They are MPs, British aristocrats, military figures, and the like. And they find it astonishingly easy to have audiences with Hitler and his leading lieutenants. And the negative impact they have, I'm not saying it was deterministic. I don't think that if all of these people who have been put into novels like Kazuo Ishiguro's Remains of the Day, if they had all stayed at home, that the Second World War wouldn't have broken out. But what it does is it reinforces a view in Germany, among Nazi Germany, that Britain is still ruled by an aristocratic oligarchy, that serious foreign policy decisions are made in aristocratic salons or indeed in Buckingham Palace, and that the British are overwhelmingly pro-German and anti-communist, which they are, but but that's only a small section of the society that the Germans are seeing. As to why these often fairly curious and eccentric figures keep on going out to visit Nazi Germany, I think there are a variety of factors. I don't think it's insignificant that almost all of the leading figures who go and try and conduct sidebar negotiations with Hitler don't actually have that much influence in Britain. I think there are personal reasons they're going. They are has-beens. They're newspaper proprietors who aren't taken seriously by the government, or aristocrats who aren't no longer in the cabinet, and they're not really consulted anymore. They're there as decoration of the British political scene, but they're not part of it. Whereas suddenly they go to Germany and they get audiences with the most powerful man in the world, and I think that flatters them. I think that they're there because a lot of them fought in the First World War, and they genuinely believe that if you could only show fellowship with the Germans, that a Second World War could be avoided. And there is an overwhelming feeling that communism is a greater danger, and that having some large fascist bloc in the centre of Europe is a good thing. So I think those are all reasons.
Now, Neville Chamberlain, of course, went, as you mentioned, not once but twice, and well, more than twice actually in the end. What is your sense? Do you think history has been too hard on him, or do you think we put it about right in putting him pretty much right at the bottom of our prime ministers? He's down there with sort of Lord North and Anthony Eden, isn't he?
Yes, I don't think that he's going to move much further up the leaderboard than that. I think history has, however, got him wrong. I think there's the popular conception of Chamberlain, particularly contrasting to Churchill's bulldog spirit, is that he is a sort of weak prime minister. Neville Chamberlain was one of the most powerful prime ministers, as you very eloquently wrote about in Eminent Churchillians and your book on Lord Halifax, both of which I recommend people to read. A man who had huge parliamentary majorities and an absolute solid conviction about what he wanted to do, and no squeamishness whatsoever about using all the apparatus of the state to achieve it. He tapped Churchill's telephone and spied on political opponents. He conducted secret diplomacy with Mussolini behind the backs of the Foreign Office. He had conducted secret diplomacy with the Germans. Neville Chamberlain was an extremely determined prime minister who wielded great power. However,
Sorry, carry on. No, I'll ask the question. Apologies.
No, I was just going to say that, however, the ultimate judgment of history has to be that he failed. Appeasement was not there to delay a war; it was to avoid war for all time, and that failed. And I think he continued to pursue the policy beyond which even many of his fellow appeasers, such as Lord Halifax, thought was it defied reason and it defied the evidence. And although there are certain things which are greatly to his credit, that he's diverted money away from building up what might have been a rather obsolete large army in the early 1930s when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, towards building up the Royal Air Force, his main efforts did end in failure.
Of course, it was the Royal Air Force that he did build that ultimately won the Battle of Britain. Those Hurricanes and Spitfires were built in the year between Munich and the outbreak of war. So might one be able to argue that Chamberlain bought the year necessary to rearm in order to defend ourselves and win the Battle of Britain, and therefore stay free and independent?
You can definitely make that argument, and that is the most common argument that is put in Chamberlain's favour, and indeed in favour of the whole policy of appeasement. I think there are three major flaws in this argument. One is it's entirely retrospective, as Horace Wilson, Chamberlain's right-hand man, and Alec Douglas-Hume, his parliamentary private secretary, say afterwards. It's only fair to say that we weren't trying to delay war at Munich so that we could be better rearmed. We were trying to avoid it, and we did believe we had avoided it. Indeed, Neville Chamberlain's most famous quotation is, "This is not just peace with honour, but peace for our time." And when figures like Lord Halifax come to him and effectively say afterwards, "You've been very lucky," we don't believe that this is going to be Hitler's last territorial demand. We must severely increase and expedite rearmament. Chamberlain is very resistant to that. I also feel that if you take all of the other problem with the argument is that it assumes that the year September 1938 to September 1939 is one that is only a time that exists in Britain. It also exists in Germany, and the Germans are continuing to rearm. And if I think you look at the figures, not in at sea, not in the Navy, but in the building of the German Air Force and tanks and so on, it's clear that the Germans managed to out-arm the British in that period. And finally, the strategic situation severely deteriorates. In theory, there was a coalition which could have gone to war in September 1938, which included a fairly robust Czech army, the French army, which was facing incomplete West Wall or Siegfried Line and very few German divisions on the Western Front, Great Britain and her empire, and possibly Russia. But by September 1939, Czechoslovakia is gone, and the Soviet Union is in alliance with Nazi Germany. I think the strategic and diplomatic situation is worse.
And what about Churchill? Tell us about why he and a tiny group of supporters managed to take such a very different attitude to the whole appeasement issue than Chamberlain and the government. I mean, what did they see that Chamberlain and the others didn't, and why were they able to see that?
Well, I'd really like to, as the Churchill's biographer, I'd really like to put the question straight back at you. So I'll give a very short answer, and then I'd love to know what you think. But I think it helps that Churchill, in a way, it's an odd question. It's quite hard to try and work out why someone gets something right. Why somebody, I mean, it's something which seems incredibly obvious to us now. In retrospect, it's sort of more an interesting a problem as to why everyone else got it wrong. I think it helps that Churchill is not in the government. And I think, I don't know what you think of this as his biographer, I think it's not insignificant that he's working on his life of Marlborough throughout the 1930s. And one of the things that he continually, and the other anti-appeasers keep on coming back to, is that it is a consistent principle of British foreign policy to never allow one power to dominate the continent. And he's writing about his ancestor trying to prevent the dominance and hegemony of Louis XIV, the Sun King. So I think all of that, but the crucial thing is, why he sees this and everyone else doesn't is more shrouded in mystery, is that he understands the fanaticism, the militarism, the racialism of the Nazis. His warnings begin in 1932 that they are not after mere revision of treaties and increased status. They are after the return of lost territories and colonies and ever-growing German power. But I'd love to know what you think.
This is my interview of you, Tim. If other people want to know what I think, they can ask me the question. I've only got a couple more minutes to ask you questions. And the next one is, we're on a show for a bookshop in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. So tell me about the American angle. What effect did the United States have on all of this?
The United States didn't have a massive effect because they were isolationists. However, I do think that it's one of the major charges that can be laid at Chamberlain's door that he did absolutely nothing to court the United States and did an awful lot to offend them. Right early on, when he becomes Prime Minister, President Roosevelt asks if he will pay a visit to Washington, and you could just imagine that Churchill would have leapt at that and would have been on the Queen Mary straight away. Chamberlain says no. And then in January 1938, when the president comes up with a plan which he thinks is going to result in peace, essentially a quid pro quo, where he wants a global conference which is going to give distribute resources, natural resources around the world in an equitable manner in return for general disarmament. It's a scheme which has absolutely no chance of succeeding, and Chamberlain realizes that. But his unwillingness to go along with it is, I think, and is what Anthony Eden ultimately fell out with him over, severely short-sighted, because it was America attempting to take the initiative in international affairs and becoming involved. And if you're a country that is desperate to end American isolation, then becoming involved is important. The fact that the conference wouldn't have succeeded, probably because the Germans would have never consented to take part, would have had an important effect on American public opinion. And I think it was very short-sighted of Chamberlain to have refused that American initiative for those reasons.
But of course, the Roosevelt administration was very pleased about Munich. He sent a telegram saying "good man," didn't he, to Neville Chamberlain? I mean, they of course, the Americans didn't get involved in the Second World War until Adolf Hitler declared war on them in December 1941, which is a long way on from Munich. So do you really think that the Chamberlain ministry could have drawn the American administration, the Roosevelt administration, towards anything like the situation of bellicosity that we needed from them?
No, I don't. I don't think that there was anything, as Churchill later showed, when the situation was far greater and he played and courted the American president much more effectively. I don't think there was ever a realistic possibility that the Americans would have offered much more, but to have cold shouldered them the way he did, I don't think was necessarily adding to Britain's strategic advantages. And the only other thing I'd say, it's a bit, Roosevelt's attitude to Munich and appeasement is, like so much of what Roosevelt did, is ambiguous. His quarantine speech of the year before, 1937, indicates that he's very much against these fascist coups in the center of Europe, and he's severely critical of Chamberlain also at the time of Munich and in the run-up to it. So, and American public opinion, one could argue slightly hypocritically, because they were forever saying that they wanted peace and didn't want to be involved in war, but they were very critical of what they later came to be seen as Britain selling out Czechs. So I think for Britain's standing in the world and for future negotiations, it would have been wiser to have recognized that if a war was ever to come, Britain was going to be dependent on the United States and start to treat her accordingly.
Right. Now, I've taken up 33 minutes of your time, and so I'm going to throw it open now to the audience, a large audience and an impressive one, and hand over to Alex to compare the rest.
Yeah. First off, just a thank you to Andrew and Tim for this interview. This was just really a delight. So we're going to open up to the audience right now. Viewers out there, if you have a question, feel free to use the Ask a Question button. It is below my face here. We already have just a wonderful amount of questions. So I'll get started here. And of course, most of these questions I'd like to direct to Tim, but Andrew, please jump in. We'd love to hear your opinion on these as well. Our first question is from Susan. They ask, what is the single biggest lesson that Chamberlain learned in hindsight, and what did he regret? We'll start with Tim.
Chamberlain later said that such faith as I ever had in dictators is rapidly being whittled away. That was after Mussolini had invaded Albania in May 1939. I think the single greatest lesson, although Chamberlain didn't admit of many mistakes himself, so whether he recognized this or not, was his failure to recognize the true nature and intent of the Hitler regime. He wasn't uninformed. The key passages of Mein Kampf had been translated by the Foreign Office and shared with the cabinet. He read a very important book by the Australian historian Stephen Roberts called The House That Hitler Built, in which Roberts clearly stated that Hitler could not achieve his foreign policy aims without war. But he thought he knew better, and he wrote to his sisters, having read this book by Roberts, which he read in January 1937-38. He wrote to his sisters, if I accepted the author's conclusions, I should despair, but I don't and won't. It was a belief that you could do business with this man that led to his undoing.
I have nothing to add to that. Absolutely right.
Our next question is from Melvin. They ask, assuming that Britain may not have been militarily prepared for war in 1938, if they had shown willing to engage militarily against Germany, would Hitler have pulled back or retreated?
Sorry, well, I'm going to assume that you answer them all first, Tim, but my sense is that he would have back in 1936 at the time of the Rhineland. We know he would have pulled back then, but not by 38. By 38, he would have enveloped Czechoslovakia. Although Czechoslovakia had arms factories and a strong defences on its border, after the Sudetenland effectively went to Germany, it would have been impossible for the Czechs to have held back the Germans. The Poles were not about to go to war. In fact, if anything, they grabbed Teschen, which was a small part of Czechoslovakia, in an appallingly opportunistic move in September 1938. And so my sense is that the Germans would still have crushed Czechoslovakia. There would have been some advantages in the whole war starting a bit earlier, but it would not have saved Prague. But I'm looking to Tim's view on this and be interested.
I agree. I think there are moments where throughout most of the summer of 1938, Hitler is absolutely determined to go to war, but mainly because he doesn't believe that the British and the French will go to war. But the only thing to say, would he pull back? There is an instance of him pulling back, and we could debate the reasons why he does it. Reason the Munich conference occurs is because Hitler is persuaded to pursue a diplomatic solution at the last moment and accept this small portion of Czechoslovakia, merely the Sudetenland, rather than the whole of it, which is what we know he wanted. And one part of the reasons of that is it seems that the British and the French did seem to be a bit more in earnest, but also he's aware that the German people aren't really behind him. And he watches a military display in Berlin, and there seems to be a distinct lack of war spirit. So it's possible. I mean, I don't believe anything's impossible. I think Andrew's totally right that the moment to have it would have been very hard to have avoided a war in September from 1938, and indeed from 1937 onwards. Stopping Hitler would have probably involved a war. If the British and the French wanted to avoid a war altogether, then they needed to move at the Rhineland. I think was their last chance, but there were lots of legitimate historical reasons why they weren't prepared to move then.
It's also worth pointing out, I think, that the German generals after the Second World War made a huge thing about how if only Chamberlain and France had stood firm at Munich, they were going to overthrow Hitler. There's no real evidence behind that whatsoever. The German generals, who really waited until the 20th of July 1944 to move against Hitler, would not have tried to have overthrown him in the period of Munich either.
I agree.
This next question is from Swagata. They ask, oh, I just lost it. One sec here. How much did the press influence public opinion during the appeasement years in Britain and beyond?
The press has an enormous impact. The Daily Express carried a banner headline for much of the year 1938 saying there will be no war. The Labour papers were all not only against, the Labour papers took a slightly different view. They were rather against, they were very against the Nazis, but campaigning strongly against measures which might ultimately lead to Britain confronting them, mainly rearmament. The Daily Mail was on the complete flip. It campaigned very hard for rearmament, and it had a massive campaign. And the proprietor of the British newspaper, the Daily Mail, even funded the design of a bomber. Yet the Daily Mail, on the other hand, was far more sympathetic to the domestic agenda that the Germans were setting out, and thought that it was right to court Hitler to a certain extent. And then the Times, a much smaller, the Times, which I guess in American terms maybe you would regard it as the Washington Post, the establishment newspaper. It was so close to the government that foreign chancelleries considered a leader in the Times to accurately reflect government policy. And this caused a number of dramas when there was actually a divergence between government policy and what the Times was writing. So I think the press had an enormous impact on public opinion.
Yes, but I think that there is something to the idea of the Times being the public voice of the government. The Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, lunched on a very regular basis in his club, the Travellers Club, with the editor of the Times, Geoffrey Dawson, who he was a great friend of, and they were both Dons at Emeritus Fellows at All Souls, Oxford. And there's a key moment on the 7th of September 1938 when the Times has a leader which implies that the government should, in fact, give the contiguous areas of the Sudetenland, contiguous with Germany, to Germany. And that is taken very much as being a sort of a wink, a hint, nudge from the government. So, so your questioner is absolutely right. It's the press is tremendously important during all of this.
This next question is from Lorenzo. They ask, what are the reasons for why the French were so reluctant to confront the Nazis during the mid-1930s?
The French have been invaded by the Germans twice, in 1870 and in 1914. They suffered even more than the British did in the First World War, and they're much closer to the Germans. They are demographically disadvantaged. The German population, despite chunks of Germany having been split off at Versailles, is at least a third greater than that of France. And there's a serious fear of a revolution within France. France is so politically divided that even when there is a Popular Front government in 1936, which should be and wishes to support the Republicans in Spain, they are unable to, and even close the French border, because they're so concerned that there could be, that France is so riven with divisions of monarchists, pro-fascists, communists, social democrats. It's a very, very difficult place, and the financial situation of France is always teetering on brink. But really, I think it's morale. I think the reasons which lead to the very swift defeat of France in June 1940 are the same reasons why France is unwilling to confront Germany, or certainly unwilling to confront Germany without Britain backing her all the way. They are, the French General Staff, although they have built up a considerably large army, are defeatist about their prospects with regard to this fairly small, what was until 1936 still a much, much smaller German military.
I agree with all of that.
This next question is from Amanda. They ask, what events or event between 1933 and 1938 indicated to Chamberlain that Hitler would have appeased with the Munich Pact? Was there a specific event or a more generalized failure to recognize the threat?
Sorry, could you just repeat the question?
Sorry, yes, let me. What events between 1933 and 1938 indicated to Chamberlain that Hitler would have been appeased with the Munich Pact? Was there a specific event or a more generalized failure to recognize the threat?
Well, Hitler's very clever in that he never says, my ultimate intention is to take over Europe and later the world. He is always saying, this is my last demand. I only want an army the same size as Britain and France. I only want the Saarland. I only want the Rhineland. And then he goes on to the next one. I only want Austria. And when he goes into Austria, he says he has no interest in the Czechs. And when he's talking about Czechoslovakia, he says he has only interest in the German parts of it. So if you take Hitler at his word, although you, a shrewder statesman might have been clocking up the number of lies and treaties he'd told and treaties he'd broken, then you had a willingness to believe him. And the other thing is, he is genuinely pro-British. He believes that the British Empire is a stabling force in the world. He doesn't believe that the Germans can take it over. He admires the British. He thinks that there's some sort of racial kinship between the Germans and the British. And so he does say lots of very flattering things to British visitors and British statesmen. The deal, and this is where appeasement just was never going to work, the deal is that Britain has to give him a free hand in most of Europe. Whether he would have gone against France if France had also given him a free hand in Central and Eastern Europe is unknowable. But the British weren't prepared to let him dominate the whole continent.
I think also, if you're looking for a particular, your questioner seems to be looking for a particular moment, I would say the 1935 Anglo-German naval agreement would be that moment. This is a moment where Neville Chamberlain believes that you can do a deal with Hitler. He wasn't Prime Minister at the time, of course, he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, but he was delighted by this agreement because it meant that he didn't have to spend so much money on naval rearmament. And it looks like you could then go down the route of basically giving Germany back its African colonies, and that they might be happy enough with that, and it would lead therefore to a general European settlement, which is something that's at the back of all the politicians' minds and the diplomats' minds in the Foreign Office, this idea that there might be a general settlement that you can finally sign with Germany. You no longer have to feel guilty about being too tough on the Germans in the Versailles Treaty of 1919, and that therefore there is an ultimate deal that can be done with him. And the Anglo-German naval agreement seems to be a moment at which Hitler's good intentions are sort of signed, sealed, and delivered, however completely absurd and wrong that turned out to be.
This next question is from Diane. They ask, was there a realistic option for Churchill and or Roosevelt to challenge Stalin's carve out of Eastern Europe, or did they simply have no interest?
Well, that's going beyond the scope of my book and very much into Andrew's territory. I don't know whether you want to say that first, Andrew?
Well, the big problem, of course, by then was that you had well over 2 million Red Army troops stationed in Poland. By 1945, by the time of Yalta, when your question is asking about, there's very little alternative because you have this vast Russian army, and how you could do anything other than believe the lies that Stalin was telling at Yalta about the independence and integrity of Poland is very difficult to work out. What they decided to do, both Churchill and Roosevelt, and it is a big blot on their escutcheon, undoubtedly, was to make the best of it and hope that Stalin was telling the truth, which clearly, of course, he wasn't.
I agree with all of that.
So this next question, and we are running out of time, so we'll just have time for just a couple more questions here. This next question is from Penny, and they ask, with the 80th anniversary of Dunkirk in our minds, do you think, even momentarily, Halifax and Chamberlain, even Churchill, wanted to ask for terms at that time?
Well, can I answer that one? Because it's, it's very much chapter 21 of my book. The answer is that Halifax did, Churchill didn't. And because Chamberlain came down on Churchill's side, it did not go ahead. Had Halifax become Prime Minister, which he very easily could have in May 1940 instead of Churchill, then they would have asked for peace terms, and Hitler would undoubtedly have given him any peace terms that he wanted, including the independence and integrity of Britain, saving the Royal Navy, and so on, allowing the troops back, and so on. So it came up to an absolute knife edge, and it was absolutely essential. One of those moments in history where having the right person at the right time was utterly essential, that Churchill should be there.
Yeah, and I just to emphasize Andrew's point, it's very significant that it is Chamberlain who comes down at that crucial moment on the right side in the War Cabinet discussions, and he's much maligned in the film Darkest Hour as appearing to be conniving with Halifax for peace, when in fact it was the opposite was true.
Okay, one more question on the book. It said, in your opinion, was Chamberlain arrogant towards America and Germany?
I think he was quite arrogant towards America. Lots of British people were very anti-American and said rude things. He said, we have the misfortune to be dealing with a nation of cads at some stage. He rather interestingly, though very accurately, did predict the only circumstances in which America would become involved. His main frustration with America was that they were never prepared to stand up to Japanese aggression in the Far East. And he wrote at the time that he was trying to either face down or come to some sort of détente with Japan. I'm afraid we can hope for nothing from the Americans unless the Japanese attack their Pacific coast or Hawaii or something like that. And he wrote that in the mid-1930s, so it's a very prescient comment. I don't think he was arrogant with regard to Germany. I think he was rather in awe. I think he was a fairly arrogant person. I think he was in awe of German military might, and I think he was too easily played when in his 3 encounters with Adolf Hitler, but I don't think he had a particular arrogance about the Germans being inferior or anything like that.
I'd agree with all of that. I think also, though, it's worthwhile remembering that that he didn't know America. Very, very few British politicians of the 1930s did know America. Winston Churchill, of course, being the huge example, of somebody who genuinely did, because he went over to America a lot. He was half American. He liked America and so on. But by and large, the British high command and certainly their military and political high command, he didn't know America very well at all and tended to be immensely snobbish. There are some terrible sort of throwaway remarks about the Yankees that really make you cringe when you read them 80 years later.
All right, and for our final question, Tim, our viewers want to know, what are you working on next?
So I'm working on a diplomatic history, looking at the diplomacy of the Allies during the Second World War. So sort of a sequel. It's nothing to do with strategy. If you want to read about Allied strategy, you should read Andrew's book, Masters and Commanders, which has definitively dealt with that subject. So it's not looking at why you should invade Sicily rather than Sardinia, but it's the quest of the British to acquire allies, having been alone in 1940, and then the difficulties of working with allies, which include obviously, aside from the Americans, the Soviet Union, but also the Free French and neutrals, when everyone has rather different war aims and political ideologies. So that's what I'm working on at the moment.
Tim, Andrew, thank you so much for joining. It's been such an honor to host you and introduce you to our viewers. If you'd like to purchase the book, it is Appeasement. If you want to purchase the book, click the green button. Again, it's towards the bottom of the screen, just below our faces here. Click that green button. That'll take you to our website, and you can purchase Appeasement, or of course, Churchill, Walking with Destiny. We've got plenty of books for sale. Tim, congratulations, and thank you, Andrew. I'll give you both the last word. If we want to start with Andrew, then we'll kick it over to Tim.
Well, actually, I was just reminded of a very good joke. Tim, you've got to get this in your book on diplomacy of the Second World War. There's a marvelous moment when they're trying to decide, the British cabinet's trying to decide how they're going to deal with Turkey, how to try and get Turkey in the war. This is November 1943. And some members of the cabinet want to have the carrot approach, the others want the stick approach, you know, do you charm them or do you coerce them? And Winston Churchill said, and remember, this is November 1943, and he said to Anthony Eden, tell Turkey that Christmas is coming.
It's very good. The joy of doing the whole period is Churchill's witticisms. I never found in all of my looking at the 1930s a single instance of Hitler ever making a joke. I'm not a Hitler scholar. I don't know whether Ian Kershaw or Volker Ulrich have ever found Hitler making a joke, but the humanity of Churchill and his humor is something that keeps you ticking along.
Okay, thank you guys again. Stay safe, and to our viewers out there, stay safe and happy reading. See you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.